The great chamber of the Galactic Council floated in the darkness of space like a giant metal flower. Its silver petals spread wide around the central hub, where 12 different alien species had gathered to decide the fate of humanity. Inside, the main hall, the air hummed with tension and the soft glow of holographic displays. Ambassador Jiwan sat quietly in her chair, her hands folded in her lap. She had served as Earth's representative for 15 years and had never seen the council so angry. Around the curved walls, the other delegates whispered among themselves in languages that sounded like music, static, and grinding stone. Their translator devices buzzed constantly as accusations flew back and forth. The Velkari delegate stood first. Its body was made of living crystal that changed colors when it spoke. Right now it glowed angry red. The creature's voice came through the speakers like breaking glass. "The humans have gone too far this time," it said. "Captain Minho broke every safety rule we have. He put everyone at risk." Jiwan remembered the report from Proxima Station. A mining accident had trapped 37 Thexian workers deep underground. The mine was flooded with poisonous gas, and the official rescue protocol said to wait for specialized equipment. But Minho had taken his ship down anyway. He had risked his crew's lives to save alien workers he had never met before. All 37 Thexians had lived. 3 humans had died from gas poisoning. The Thexian delegate made a chittering sound that meant disagreement. Its insect-like body clicked as it moved. "The humans saved our people," it said through its translator. "Without them, all would have died." "That is exactly the problem," hissed the Mordani representative. The snake-like creature's scales rippled with displeasure. "Humans always think they know better than the rules. They act on emotion instead of logic. They are dangerous." Other voices joined in. The Quinari delegate, who looked like a walking tree, rustled its leaves in agreement. "Humans form inappropriate attachments," it said in a voice like wind through branches. "They adopt alien children as if they were their own species. This is not natural." The hexapod representative clicked its 8 legs against the floor. "They interfere in matters that do not concern them. When our colony ship was attacked by pirates, human vessels came to help without being asked. They lost 2 ships saving creatures they had never seen before. This behavior is unstable." Jiwan listened to each accusation with growing sadness. Every complaint was about humans helping others. Every criticism was about humans caring too much. She thought about Dr. Hugh, who had spent 20 years developing crops that could feed 6 different species. She thought about Engineer Dabin, who had worked in dangerous conditions to build terraforming machines for alien worlds. She thought about the thousands of human medical workers, teachers, and engineers who had given their lives to help creatures from other stars. The Velkari delegate's crystal body flared brighter. The mining incident was the final proof, it declared. Humans cannot follow simple safety procedures. They endanger everyone with their emotional decisions. They must be removed from the council before they cause more chaos. Council Speaker. Thekra raised its 6 arms for silence. The ancient creature had led the council for over a century. Its gray skin was covered in ceremonial scars that showed its wisdom and age. "The accusation has been made," it said in a deep voice that shook the chamber. "According to council law, we must vote. All in favor of expelling humanity from the 4 Galactic Council." 11 arms, claws, tentacles, and crystal formations rose into the air. Only the human delegation kept their hands down. Jiwan felt her heart break as she looked around the chamber. These were species that humans had helped for generations. The Velkari colonies that survived because of human food technology. The Mordani, worlds that were protected by human defense fleets. The Quinari research stations where human and alien scientists worked together to unlock the secrets of the universe. "The vote is unanimous," Thekra announced. "Humanity is expelled from the Galactic Council. All human colonies outside the Sol system must be abandoned within 1 standard year. All human military vessels must withdraw from Council space. All joint projects involving humans are to be terminated immediately." The chamber fell silent except for the soft hum of the life support systems. Jiwan stood slowly, her legs feeling weak. She looked around at the faces of creatures she had considered friends. Some wouldn't meet her eyes. Others stared at her with expressions she couldn't read. "We came to the stars looking for friends," she said quietly. Her voice carried clearly through the chamber's acoustic systems. "We offered our knowledge, our strength, our lives to build something beautiful together. We shared our music, our stories, our dreams. We fought beside you against the Void Hunters. We died protecting your children." She paused and looked directly at each delegate. "If you find our compassion so terrible, if our willingness to sacrifice for others disgusts you so much, then we will honor your decision. Humanity will return to our home system. We will take with us our dangerous emotions and our unstable desire to help others." Jiwan walked toward the exit, her footsteps echoing in the silent chamber. At the great doors, she turned back one last time. "We wish you well in the galaxy you are creating without us," she said. "May you find the cold logic you prefer so much more comfortable than the warmth of friendship." The doors sealed behind her with a soft hiss. Within hours, messages were flying to every human outpost in the galaxy. The evacuation began immediately. Captain Sura received orders to withdraw her defense fleet from the Vega perimeter, where they had guarded against Void Hunter attacks for 30 years. Dr. Hayek was told to pack up his research on Andromeda Station and destroy any data that might help the aliens continue his work. Engineer Dabin got instructions to shut down the terraforming project on Kepler 438b and leave the half-finished world to die. But something unexpected happened as the evacuation ships arrived at human colonies. Aliens came too. Not the proud delegates who had voted humanity out, but ordinary creatures who had lived and worked alongside humans. Thexian families whose children attended human schools. Old Quinari, who had been treated by human doctors when their own people had given up on them. Young Mordani artists whose paintings had been displayed in human galleries. They came with their possessions packed in simple bags, asking to leave with their human friends. They were tired of the cold logic their leaders preferred. They wanted to go where compassion was not considered a weakness. The evacuation ships made room for them all. Human captains looked at their passenger lists and saw names from a dozen different worlds. Families of different species sat together, sharing food and stories as they prepared for the long journey to human space. Children who looked like insects, plants, and crystals played together in the ship corridors while their parents talked about the new lives they would build together. The great human exodus had begun, but humanity was not leaving alone. They were taking with them everyone who believed that caring for others was not a crime, that emotional bonds were not manipulation, that sacrifice for strangers was not madness. As the last human ship left council space, Ambassador Jiwan sat in her cabin looking out at the stars. She wondered how long it would take the council to realize what they had lost. She wondered if they would understand that humans had not been the problem, but the solution to problems they didn't even know they had. The ship jumped to hyperspace, carrying its mixed cargo of humans and alien refugees toward an uncertain but hopeful future in the Sol system. Behind them, the Galactic Council continued its session, making plans for a galaxy without the dangerous influence of human emotion. 6 months had passed since the Council's vote, and the human evacuation was nearly complete. Across the galaxy, research stations went dark, defense platforms powered down, and terraforming projects ground to a halt. The great human experiment in galactic cooperation was ending not with war or disaster, but with the quiet closing of doors and the gentle hum of ships departing for home. Dr. Hayek stood in his laboratory on Andromeda Station, carefully packing the last of his research samples. For 23 years, he had worked with scientists from 7 different species to develop crops that could grow on alien worlds. His hybrid grains could survive in the acidic soil of Velkari planets, while his modified root vegetables thrived in the frozen ground of hexapod colonies. The work had taken decades, but it had fed millions of creatures across dozens of worlds. His Zephyrian research partner, Kalos, helped him seal the sample containers. Kalos looked like a giant butterfly, made of silver metal, with delicate wings that chimed like bells when he moved. The Zephyrian had chosen to leave with the humans rather than stay and watch their joint research be destroyed. The Council says our work was contaminated by human emotional bias, Kalos said, his musical voice sad. They want to start over with pure logical methods. Hayek smiled sadly as he placed another sample in the transport case. 23 years of trials, failures, and small victories, he said. Millions of test plants that died so we could learn what worked, all contaminated by the terrible human habit of caring whether people starve. They worked in comfortable silence, two friends from different worlds packing up a lifetime of shared dreams. Outside the laboratory windows, other human facilities were shutting down across the research station. The medical center where Dr. Bomi had developed treatments that worked on 5 different alien physiologies was being cleared out. The engineering lab where human and Mordani scientists had designed new types of space engines was going dark. On the industrial world of Kepler 438b, engineer Dabin supervised the shutdown of the massive terraforming engines his team had built over 15 years. The machines were works of art as much as science, their curved surfaces designed to blend with the planet's natural landscape. They had been changing the world's atmosphere, slowly making it breathable for the hexapod colonists who would otherwise face extinction as their homeworld died. The shutdown process was delicate work. The atmospheric processors couldn't just be turned off all at once, or the planet's weather systems would collapse. Dabin had to reduce their power gradually, allowing the artificial climate to stabilize at its current level. It wouldn't be enough to save the hexapod colony in the long term, but it would buy them a few more years. His hexapod work crews watched sadly as the great machines powered down. Their 8 legs clicked against the metal gratings as they moved around the facility, checking systems one last time. These workers had spent their lives maintaining the terraforming project. They had learned human engineering techniques and had taught humans about hexapod technology in return. Many of them were planning to leave with the human evacuation fleet. The Council says they will find another way to complete the terraforming, Dabin told his crew chief, a hexapod named Tikri who had worked with him for 12 years. They have the technical specifications for everything we built. Tikri's translator crackled with static that meant bitter laughter. Specifications are just words and numbers, she said. They do not contain the knowledge of why we built things this way, or what to do when the systems break in ways we never expected. They do not contain the patience to work for 15 years on a project that might fail. The last of the atmospheric processors shut down with a deep rumble that shook the ground. The hexapod workers stood in silence, knowing they were watching the death of their new world. Without human expertise and the willingness to work in dangerous conditions for decades, no other species had the combination of technical skill and stubborn determination needed to complete the project. Captain Sura stood on the bridge of her flagship as the human defense fleet withdrew from the Vega perimeter. For 30 years, her ships had maintained early warning stations and defensive platforms that protected 3 star systems from Void Hunter attacks. The twisted metal creatures that came from dark space were one of the galaxy's worst nightmares, and the humans had volunteered to guard the most dangerous approach routes. Her tactical officer, Lieutenant Yuna, watched the displays as defense platforms powered down one by one. The Council forces are already repositioning to cover our sectors, she reported. Their response time to any attack will be 43 hours longer than ours was. Sura nodded grimly. The human early warning systems had been built with typical human paranoia, detecting threats long before other species considered them dangerous. Human defense doctrine was based on the assumption that any delay could mean civilian casualties, so they maintained ships and equipment at constant readiness. Other species found this approach wasteful and overly aggressive. Send final status. Reports to all Council defense coordinators, Sura ordered. Include detailed information about Void Hunter attack patterns, optimal patrol routes, and maintenance schedules for the defensive platforms we're leaving behind. The reports were transmitted to Council Command and received with the same bureaucratic indifference that had marked most human offers of help. Brief acknowledgments and formal thanks, nothing more. No questions about the decades of experience behind the reports. No requests for clarification about the warnings contained in the data. As the human fleet prepared to jump to hyperspace, Sura received a final message from Council Admiral Wanho, a Quinari who had worked with human forces for decades. "I wish you were not leaving," the message said. "Your people understand threats that others prefer to ignore. I fear we will learn the cost of that ignorance." The jump to hyperspace engaged with a flash of light, and the Vega perimeter was left to the protection of forces that had never faced a real Void Hunter attack. At spaceports across the galaxy, something remarkable was happening. As human evacuation ships arrived to collect their people, they found crowds of aliens waiting to board. These were not the proud delegates who had voted humanity out of the Council, but ordinary creatures who had lived and worked alongside humans for generations. There were Thexian families whose children had grown up speaking both their native, clicking language and human standard. There were elderly Quinari whose lives had been saved by human medical technology when their own doctors had given up hope. There were young Mordani artists whose sculptures had been displayed in human galleries, their work finally appreciated by creatures who understood that beauty didn't always follow logical rules. They came carrying simple bags and desperate hopes, asking to leave with their human friends and neighbors. They were tired of leaders who saw compassion as weakness and emotional bonds as manipulation. They wanted to go somewhere that caring for others was not considered a mental illness. Captain Gina commanded one of the evacuation ships collecting refugees from the Proxima system. Her passenger manifest read like a catalog of species diversity: 847 humans, 234 Thexians, 156 Quinari, 89 Mordani, 45 Velkari dissidents who disagreed with their Crystal Collective's decision, and representatives from 6 other species who had chosen exile rather than stay in a galaxy that rejected their human friends. The ship's corridors buzzed with a dozen different languages as families of mixed species shared meals and stories. Children who looked like insects, plants, crystals, and mammals played together in the recreation areas while their parents discussed plans for new lives in human space. Medical Officer Dr. Suho moved through the crowd, treating minor injuries and illnesses across 7 different physiologies with the cross-species medical knowledge that humans had developed over decades of cooperation. In the cargo holds, the evacuees had packed more than just personal belongings. They carried cultural treasures, scientific data, and artistic works that represented the best of galactic civilization. Thexian music crystals that sang in harmonies no human ear could fully appreciate. Quinari poetry that grew like living trees, in the mind of the reader. Mordani sculptures that seemed to move when viewed from different angles. Velkari mathematical proofs that revealed the hidden music in quantum mechanics. The great human exodus was carrying away more than just humanity. It was taking the dreams, hopes, and achievements of everyone who believed that differences between species were strengths to be celebrated, rather than problems to be solved. As the evacuation fleet gathered at the edge of Council space for the long journey to the Sol system, Admiral Jiwan looked at the reports streaming in from across the galaxy. Hundreds of ships carrying millions of evacuees, both human and alien. Research data from a dozen different fields. Cultural treasures from 20 different worlds. The accumulated wisdom and friendship of 3 generations of galactic cooperation. The fleet jumped to hyperspace in perfect formation, carrying its precious cargo toward an uncertain but hopeful future. Behind them, the Galactic Council continued its work, confident that they had removed a dangerous and unpredictable element from their ordered civilization. 1 year after the human exodus, the first cracks began to show in the Galactic Council's perfect logical order. It started small, with minor accidents and delayed shipments, the kind of problems that any reasonable being could explain away as coincidence or growing pains. But to those who knew what to look for, the signs were troubling. The Proxima mining station had been operating smoothly for 37 years without a single major accident. Human safety engineers had designed redundant systems and backup protocols that other species considered unnecessarily complex. The mining crews had followed human-developed procedures that seemed overly cautious, but had kept everyone alive through decades of dangerous work. Station manager Kalos, the Zephyrian who had chosen to stay behind rather than follow his human colleagues, watched the morning shift reports with growing concern. 3 minor accidents in the past week, all involving equipment that had worked perfectly under human oversight. The safety systems were still in place, but the new Valkyrie supervisors had simplified many of the procedures, removing what they called emotional redundancies. The accident happened during the day shift change, when the mining crews were at their largest. A support beam failed in Tunnel 7, causing a cascade collapse that trapped 43 workers deep underground. The emergency protocols activated automatically, sealing the tunnel to prevent further collapse, but also trapping the workers behind tons of rock and rising poisonous gas. The Valkyrie crisis team responded according to proper logical procedures. They calculated the time needed to bring in specialized rescue equipment, analyzed the risk factors involved in any rescue attempt, and determined that the most rational course of action was to wait for the proper tools to arrive. The estimated rescue time was 18 hours. The trapped miners would be dead in 6. Kelos remembered Captain Minho's rescue at this same station 2 years earlier. The human had ignored all safety protocols, taken his ship into dangerous territory, and saved every trapped worker while losing 3 of his own crew to gas poisoning. The Council had used that rescue as evidence of humanity's dangerous emotional instability. Now, as Kelos listened to the fading radio signals from the trapped miners, he understood the true cost of pure logical thinking. 43 workers died in Tunnel 7 while rescue equipment made its careful way across 3 systems. The official report noted acceptable losses within normal operational parameters. The Valkyrie colonies experienced their first major crop failures that same month. For generations they had grown crystals instead of traditional organic food, but their expanding population had required supplemental nutrition from imported grains. Dr. Hayek's hybrid crops had formed the foundation of their food security, modified to grow in the alkaline soil that killed most other plants. The Council's Agricultural Committee had rejected the human crop strains as primitive biological manipulation and decided to develop new food sources using pure crystalline logic. Their approach was elegant and mathematically beautiful, creating perfect geometric patterns in the soil that should have produced optimal nutrition for crystal-based life forms. The crops withered and died within weeks. Agricultural Director Tharn, a young Valkyrie who had studied under Dr. Hyuk before the evacuation, tried to explain the problem to the Council Committee. The human crops were not just genetically modified, she said, her crystal body flickering with frustrated colors. They were adapted through decades of trial and error, learning from thousands of failures. Each strain carried the accumulated wisdom of interaction between plant, soil, and environment. The committee chair dismissed her concerns with a flash of cold blue light. Wisdom is simply data that has not been properly analyzed, it declared. We will create new crops based on logical principles rather than emotional attachment to inferior human methods. 7 Valkyrie systems faced famine as their beautiful logical crops continued to fail. Emergency food shipments from other worlds helped prevent mass starvation, but the crisis strained the Council's resources and damaged Valkyrie confidence in their leadership. On the frontier, the first Void Hunter attack in 35 years broke through the reorganized defense lines. With devastating effect, the creatures came from the dark space between galaxies, twisted masses of living metal that consumed energy and matter with equal hunger. They moved in patterns that seemed random, but followed an alien logic that few species understood. The human. Early warning systems would have detected the incursion 43 hours before the creatures reached inhabited space. The defensive platforms would have provided coordinated fire support. The rapid response fleets would have intercepted the Void Hunters while they were still vulnerable in normal space. Instead, the attack fell on the hexapod colony ship Meridians, call like a nightmare from the void. The massive vessel carried 12,000 colonists fleeing their dying homeworld, families and workers who had spent their savings on passage to a new life among the stars. They had no weapons except basic defensive shields, no escort except a single Council patrol ship that happened to be passing through the system. Admiral Wanho commanded the Council response fleet that arrived 18 hours after the distress. Signals stopped. His Quinari sensors found only debris and the characteristic energy signature of void feeding patterns. 12,000 beings had been consumed. their life energy absorbed by creatures that turned matter into more of themselves. The official report classified the losses as strategic repositioning requirements and recommended additional study of void hunter behavioral patterns. It made no mention of the human defense systems that had prevented such attacks for 3 decades. In his private quarters, Admiral Wanho stared at the tactical displays showing the gap where human defenses used to be. The mathematical models were clear. Without human early warning networks and their willingness to sacrifice themselves for strangers, the outer systems were defenseless against threats that moved faster than conventional response times allowed. He drafted a classified memo to the Council leadership recommending immediate reconstruction of the human defense network using available personnel from member species. The response came back within hours. Request denied. Available resources are allocated to more pressing concerns. The pressing concerns included a trade dispute between the Thexians and Quinari that had escalated into a complete breakdown of diplomatic relations. For 50 years, human mediators had helped resolve such conflicts by finding common ground between radically different species. Humans had an uncanny ability to understand multiple perspectives and suggest compromises that satisfied everyone involved. Without human diplomats, the dispute festered. The Thexians accused the Quinari of deliberately contaminating trade goods with plant-based toxins that were harmless to tree-like beings, but poisonous to insect physiology. The Quinari claimed the Thexians were using psychic manipulation to influence Quinari decision-making processes. Both accusations were technically impossible, but fear and mistrust grew as the species retreated into isolation. Trade routes that had operated smoothly for generations were abandoned. Scientific collaborations ended as researchers refused to work with potential enemies. Cultural exchanges stopped as each species decided that the others were fundamentally untrustworthy. The Mordani withdrew from galactic affairs entirely, sealing their borders and refusing all contact with other species. They had always been the most suspicious members of the Council, viewing cooperation as a form of weakness. Human diplomats had gradually drawn them into collaborative projects, building trust through small gestures and patient relationship building. Without that human influence, old Mordani fears resurged. They saw the crop failures, the mining accidents, and the defense breakdowns as evidence that other species were deliberately sabotaging galactic civilization. Their snake-like forms coiled defensively around their worlds as they prepared for attacks that existed only in their increasingly paranoid imaginations. Council sessions grew shorter and more contentious, as representatives hurled accusations at each other in a dozen different languages. The great chamber that had once echoed with the sounds of productive debate now rang with threats and ultimatums. Species that had worked together for generations eyed each other with suspicion and contempt. Council mediator Suho, a former human diplomat who had stayed behind to observe the transition, watched the proceedings with growing alarm. He had been granted observer status as a representative of the independent worlds, but his attempts to mediate disputes were met with cold indifference. The other delegates seemed to blame him for humanity's departure, as if his presence reminded them of what they had lost. In quiet moments between sessions, some delegates approached him with indirect questions. They wanted to know if humanity might consider limited re-engagement, perhaps advisory roles in specific sectors where problems had emerged. The questions came through backdoor channels and unofficial contacts, careful not to suggest any admission that the expulsion had been a mistake. Suho forwarded these inquiries to the human government in the Sol system, but the responses were polite and firm. Humanity was building a new civilization with their chosen alien partners, focusing on the worlds and species that had chosen cooperation over fear. They wished the Council well, but had no interest in our 2 years after humanity's departure. The galaxy stood on the edge of complete collapse. What had begun as minor problems had grown into systemic failures that spread like a plague through every aspect of galactic civilization. The careful order that the Council had tried to maintain was crumbling faster than anyone could have imagined. Dr. Gina sat in her laboratory on New Sol, the human colony in the Centauri system, reading encrypted messages from her former colleagues across the galaxy. The communication came through hidden channels, desperate pleas for help from scientists who had once dismissed human research as emotionally contaminated. 3 more systems had fallen to the plague that was sweeping through Velkari space. The crystalline beings were dying by the millions as their perfect logical approach to medicine proved catastrophically inadequate. The Council's medical committee had rejected the treatment protocols developed jointly by human and alien doctors, calling them primitive biological guesswork. Instead, they had created new treatments based on pure mathematical analysis of crystal physiology. The treatments were elegant, efficient, and completely useless against a disease that didn't follow logical rules. The plague organism mutated faster than the Council's computers could calculate new responses. It adapted to each logical treatment by changing its structure in ways that seemed random, but followed patterns that only human intuition had been able to predict. Dr. Bomi, working from her research station in the Outer Sol system, had developed the original protocols by combining rigorous scientific method with what she called educated guessing. She watched how the disease behaved in living patients, not just in computer models. She tried treatments that seemed irrational but worked anyway. She saved lives by ignoring logic when logic failed to account for the messy reality of biology. The message from Gina's Velkari colleague was brief and desperate. "Please help us. The Council says asking for human aid would be admitting weakness, but our people are dying. If you have any treatments that might work, send them through unofficial channels. We will try anything." Gina forwarded the message to the Human Medical Council, but she already knew what the response would be. Humanity was no longer responsible for species that had rejected their help. The humans were building new hospitals and research facilities to serve the aliens who had chosen to stay with them, not the ones who had expelled them from galactic society. The terraforming project on Kepler 438b had been completely abandoned. After 18 months of failed attempts to continue the work, the hexapod colonists watched their half-finished world slowly dying as the atmospheric processors broke down one by one. Without human engineering expertise and the willingness to work in lethal conditions for decades, no other species had the combination of technical knowledge and stubborn determination needed to maintain the complex systems. Engineer Dabin had designed the terraforming network to be self-maintaining, but only if the operators understood the subtle interactions between atmospheric chemistry, weather patterns, and planetary geology. The technical manuals contained all the necessary information, but they couldn't teach the intuitive understanding that came from 15 years of hands-on experience with machinery that regularly tried to kill its operators. The Velkari engineers, who took over the project, approached it with typical crystalline logic. They analyzed the systems, calculated optimal operating parameters, and implemented efficiency improvements that looked perfect on paper. Within 6 months, 3 atmospheric processors had suffered catastrophic failures that poisoned the surrounding landscape and set back the terraforming process by decades. The surviving hexapod colonists faced extinction as their world slowly reverted to its original toxic atmosphere. Emergency evacuation ships arrived to transport the population to refugee camps on other worlds, but the camps were overcrowded and inadequately supplied. The galaxy was struggling to deal with a growing refugee crisis as more colonies failed, and entire species found themselves homeless. Tikri, the hexapod work crew chief who had learned human engineering techniques, sent regular updates to her former colleagues in the Sol system. Her messages painted a picture of systematic collapse as essential systems failed without human maintenance. "The Council believes that technical knowledge can be transferred through documentation," she wrote. "They do not understand that real expertise comes from making mistakes and learning from failure. They want to succeed on the first try so they never learn how to recover when things go wrong." The trade routes that had once connected the galaxy in a web of mutual prosperity had become hunting grounds for pirates and worse things. The great merchant convoys that carried goods between star systems now traveled with military escorts, when they traveled at all. Many routes had been abandoned entirely as the risks outweighed the profits. Captain Yuna, monitoring communications from her post on the edge of human space, intercepted desperate messages from merchant captains requesting safe passage through territories that had been secure for generations. The human patrol fleets had maintained those routes not for profit, but out of a sense of duty to the free flow of commerce and culture. They had asked for nothing in return except goodwill and the occasional resupply at friendly ports. Now those routes were lawless zones where predators hunted merchant vessels with impunity. The Council's replacement patrol ships were too few and too slow to provide adequate protection. They responded to pirate attacks according to proper procedures, filing reports and requesting additional resources that never seemed to arrive. The communication logs made for grim reading. Merchant vessel Star of Andromeda, carrying food supplies, to a famine-stricken colony, destroyed by pirates in the Vega system. Research ship Deep Thoughts, transporting critical medical equipment, captured and its crew sold into slavery. Colony Transport New Hope, evacuating refugees from a failed terraforming project, simply vanished without a trace in what had once been the safest shipping lane in the galaxy. The Galactic Council's sessions had grown chaotic and accusatory as representatives blamed each other for the cascade of failures. The great chamber that had once echoed with productive debate now rang with threats, ultimatums, and mutual recriminations. Species that had cooperated for centuries eyed each other with suspicion and contempt. The Thexian delegate accused the Quinari of deliberately contaminating trade goods with plant-based toxins. The Quinari representative claimed the Thexians were using psychic manipulation to influence tree-based decision-making processes. The Mordani had withdrawn from all contact with other species, convinced that everyone was plotting against them. Without human mediators to find common ground between radically different species, every disagreement escalated into a crisis. Humans had possessed an almost supernatural ability to understand multiple perspectives and suggest compromises that satisfied all parties. They had been the galaxy's translators not just of language, but of culture, psychology, and motivation. Council. Mediator Suho watched the proceedings with growing despair. The delegates no longer listened to each other's concerns or tried to find mutually beneficial solutions. They made demands, issued threats, and walked out of sessions when they didn't get their way immediately. The careful diplomatic protocols that had governed galactic relations for centuries were breaking down as fear and mistrust replaced cooperation and goodwill. The backroom conversations he had once facilitated between different species had stopped entirely. Representatives retreated to their separate quarters after each session, communicating only through formal diplomatic notes that grew more hostile with each exchange. The informal networks of friendship and mutual respect that had really held galactic civilization together were dissolving faster than the official structures. In his private reports to the human government, Suho painted a picture of accelerating collapse. The Council maintains the illusion of function, he wrote, but real cooperation ended when humanity left. The delegates go through the motions of debate and decision-making, but they no longer trust each other enough to implement any meaningful policies. The responses from Earth were sympathetic but firm. Humanity was focused on building a new civilization that included all species willing to embrace cooperation over dominance. They had established colonies, research stations, and cultural centers throughout the Sol system and the nearby independent worlds. Their society was growing stronger while the Council's galaxy grew weaker. Most telling of all were the unofficial contact attempts that reached human space through increasingly desperate channels. Council delegates who had voted for humanity's expulsion now sent private messages asking about the possibility of limited re-engagement. They spoke carefully about advisory positions and technical consultation that would not require formal readmission to the Council. The messages came from species facing extinction-level crises that they could not solve alone. Velkari worlds devastated by plague begged for medical assistance. Hexapod refugees requested help with terraforming projects. Quinari colonies asked for food production technology to replace the hybrid crops that were failing without human expertise. Each request was forwarded to the appropriate human authorities and received the same polite response. 5 years had passed since the Great Expulsion, and the galaxy that had once thrived under the Galactic Council's guidance had fractured into desperate, isolated fragments. The careful order that 12 species had tried to maintain was collapsing faster than anyone had imagined possible. What remained was a dark maze of failed colonies, broken trade routes and dying worlds where fear had replaced hope. The final Void Hunter incursion began at 17 points simultaneously across the former defensive perimeter. The creatures had been testing the weakened defenses for months, sending small probes that vanished as soon as Council forces arrived to investigate. The attacks had seemed random, but they followed an alien intelligence that was learning the patterns of the new defense network. Admiral Wanho stood in the command center of the Council's primary defense station, watching his tactical displays fill with red warning signals. The Void Hunters were coming through gaps in the sensor network that human early warning systems would have detected days in advance. Without those paranoid human preparations, the creatures had achieved complete tactical surprise. Defensive. Platforms are engaging the enemy, reported his tactical officer, a young Quinari whose branch-like fingers danced over the control systems. Estimated time to platform failure, 14 minutes. Wanho felt his root system contract with fear. The human defense platforms had been designed for sustained combat against overwhelming odds, powered by fusion reactors that could operate for weeks under maximum load. The Council's replacement systems were more efficient and elegant, but they lacked the redundant power systems and armor that human paranoia had considered essential. Signal all civilian ships to evacuate immediately, Wanho ordered. Do not wait for escort. Do not attempt to carry cargo. Maximum acceleration toward the inner systems. The evacuation had already begun, but it was too little and too late. Void Hunters moved faster than any organic technology, their twisted metal bodies accelerating through space by consuming the quantum foam that filled the vacuum. They fell on the fleeing colony ships like predators that had been waiting for exactly this moment. The merchant vessel. Peaceful Trader tried to defend itself with basic shields and a single energy cannon. The Void Hunters consumed the ship's power core in seconds, then used that energy to create more of themselves. The passenger liner Golden Dream carried 15,000 refugees fleeing the plague that was devastating Velkari space. It vanished in a flash of twisted light as the creatures absorbed its mass and converted the passengers into fuel for their reproduction. Wanho's defense fleet responded according to proper tactical doctrine, coordinating their movements with mathematical precision and engaging the enemy at optimal range with calculated firepower. Their approach was logical, efficient, and completely useless against creatures that seemed to bend the laws of physics through pure malevolent will. The Maya human defense fleets had fought Void Hunters for 30 years using tactics that looked insane to logical observers. They attacked at close range where the creature's energy absorption was most dangerous. They sacrificed ships to protect civilians they had never met. They used their vessels as weapons when their guns ran out of ammunition, ramming Void Hunters at speeds that guaranteed mutual destruction. It had looked like waste and madness, but it had worked, because humans understood something that other species had missed. Void Hunters were not just predators. They were parasites that grew stronger by consuming order and civilization. The only way to defeat them was with chaos, sacrifice, and the kind of reckless courage that logical minds considered insanity. Wanho's fleet died with mathematical precision, each ship falling at the calculated moment when its defensive capabilities were exhausted. There were no ramming attacks, no desperate last stands, no impossible heroics that might have disrupted the Void Hunter feeding patterns. Just efficient destruction followed by efficient consumption. The creatures swept through the outer systems like a plague of living metal, consuming everything they touched and growing larger with each meal. Colony after colony went dark as the Void Hunters converted matter and energy into more of themselves. The great defensive network that had protected galactic civilization for generations collapsed in a matter of hours. Council Speaker Thekra received the final reports in his emergency command center deep beneath the council station. His ancient hands shook as he read the casualty figures. 47 colony worlds consumed, 12 million beings dead, the entire outer defensive perimeter compromised. The mathematical models were clear. Without immediate evacuation, the core worlds would fall within days. He had led the council for over a century, through trade wars and border disputes, through scientific breakthroughs and cultural revolutions. He had prided himself on making rational decisions based on logical analysis rather than emotional impulse. He had voted to expel humanity because their dangerous sentiment threatened the order he had spent his life building. Now, as he watched his civilization die, he finally understood what that order had really cost. The humans had not been the problem. They had been the solution to problems that pure logic could never solve. Their willingness to sacrifice for strangers had held the galaxy together. Their emotional bonds had created trust between species that had nothing else in common. Their stubborn refusal to abandon hope had given everyone else the courage to keep trying when rational analysis said failure was inevitable. The evacuation ships were already departing from the Council Station, carrying the survivors of galactic civilization toward whatever refuge they could find. Thekra had been offered passage on the lead vessel, but he chose to remain at his post until the end. It was the least he could do for the galaxy he had helped to destroy. His final message was addressed to no one and everyone, broadcast on all frequencies as the Void Hunters closed in on the Council Station. We were wrong. We thought human compassion was weakness. We thought their bonds were manipulation. We thought their sacrifices were stupidity. We never understood that they were the only thing holding us together. The message ended in static as the station's power core was consumed by creatures that turned matter into hunger and hope into despair. Some of the evacuation ships made it to the inner systems, carrying refugees who had lost everything except their lives. Others were caught by Void Hunter pursuit squadrons that had learned to predict logical escape routes. A few, commanded by desperate captains who remembered human tactical doctrine, made random course changes that confused the creatures long enough to reach safety. Thekra's personal escape pod drifted through the debris field that had once been the Council's greatest achievement. His life support systems were failing, but he lived long enough to see the distant glow of human-controlled space through the pod's viewport. The Sol system burned like a warm star in the darkness, surrounded by the lights of colonies and stations, where humans and their alien friends were building something new. The galaxy behind him was dying, consumed by creatures that fed on order and civilization. But ahead lay the promise of worlds where compassion was not considered weakness, where emotional bonds were not seen as manipulation, where sacrifice for others was understood as the highest form of logic. His pod's power failed before he could reach that distant sanctuary, but his final thoughts were not of regret for his own fate. He thought about the species that had chosen to follow humanity into exile, the scientists and artists and ordinary workers who had recognized something that their leaders had missed. They had seen that humans were not dangerous predators seeking to corrupt galactic civilization, but gardeners trying to help it grow. In the Sol system, humanity thrived alongside their chosen companions from across the galaxy. The colonies that ringed Earth and Mars buzzed with activity as refugees continued to arrive from the dying Council space. Each ship brought new stories of collapse and failure, but also new hope as more species abandoned the cold logic that had failed them. Dr. Hyuk worked with agricultural specialists from 7 different worlds to develop crops that could feed the growing refugee population. His laboratories hummed with activity as scientists who had once been separated by species barriers collaborated on projects that would have been impossible under the Council's rigid hierarchies. Engineer Dabin supervised the construction of new terraforming systems on worlds that had been written off as uninhabitable. His mixed species teams combined human determination with alien expertise to accomplish what pure logic had declared impossible. They worked in dangerous conditions and accepted high failure rates because they understood that great achievements required great risks. Captain Sura commanded the defense fleets that protected the growing human sphere from void hunters and other threats. Her forces included ships crewed by dozens of different species, united not by political treaties, but by shared commitment to protecting something worth preserving. The galaxy they had known was ending, consumed by creatures that fed on the spaces between civilizations. But in human space, a new galaxy was beginning, one built on the dangerous foundation of caring for others regardless of the cost. The evacuation ships continued to arrive, carrying refugees who had finally learned the lesson that the Council had rejected too late. In a universe full of darkness,